He gave her an ultimatum: the baby or me. She chose the baby and walked away. 3 years later, he saw the little girl, and realized what he'd lost. New York buzzed with the usual chaos of the city that never slept. From the 48th floor of a sleek glass skyscraper, the skyline stretched endlessly in every direction, but inside the corner office of one of the city's most powerful CEOs, everything was still. Edward Blake sat behind a dark mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his laptop, fingers dancing across the keyboard. His tailored suit was perfect, his expression unreadable, just as it always was. Nothing distracted him. Not the breathtaking view, not the world beyond the glass. Certainly not the quiet footsteps that approached him. Hazel stood in the doorway, holding something small and trembling in her hands. She was visibly nervous, but her voice didn't shake when she finally spoke. "I'm pregnant," she said. Edward paused only for a second, enough for the weight of her words to land in the air like a dropped glass. But instead of standing up, or looking at her, or even reacting like a man whose world had just shifted, he simply kept typing for a moment longer before finally leaning back in his chair. He met her eyes. His were calm, maybe too calm. Brown, unreadable, calculating. "You know I don't want children," he said plainly. Hazel's hands tightened around the paper she had been holding, her doctor's confirmation. She had expected the conversation to be hard, but not this cold. She swallowed and took a step closer. "I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know." Edward closed the laptop slowly. His voice was quiet, but every word cut like glass. "You have a choice, Hazel. The pregnancy and the baby, or me." There was no emotion in his tone. No concern, no love, not even fear. Just a decision laid out like a business deal. Hazel stared at him, heart pounding, 1,000 thoughts swirling in her head. She could feel the walls of the room closing in. She waited for him to say he didn't mean it, to show something, anything, that proved he cared. But there was nothing. Just silence and that same cold gaze. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if answering a question that had never really been a question at all. Then she turned and walked away. No tears. No words. No door slammed. Just the sound of her fading footsteps on the marble floor. Edward didn't get up. Didn't follow. The office remained as still as before. But outside, somewhere in the city, Hazel stepped into a different future. One where she would face everything alone. One she hadn't chosen, but one she would own. The first thing Hazel noticed about Portland was the rain. It wasn't the loud, stormy kind that crashed down in dramatic sheets. It was quiet and constant, a soft mist that seemed to settle into everything: her coat, her shoes, her soul. She arrived with nothing more than a suitcase, a worn sketchpad, and the folded ultrasound photo that she kept pressed between the pages like a sacred bookmark. She hadn't told a soul in New York. No friends, no coworkers, no family. It was easier that way. No one to explain things to. No one to judge her for walking away from a man like Edward Blake. No one to make her doubt the decision she already felt deep in her bones was the right one. She found a one-bedroom apartment above a noisy coffee shop in a slightly run-down part of town. The walls were thin, the heater rattled every time it turned on, and the kitchen window wouldn't open all the way. But it was hers. Every creak and chipped tile, every faint scent of espresso that drifted upstairs in the mornings reminded her she had survived the fall and landed on her own 2 feet. She started waiting tables at a nearby diner on the night shift, where the tips were barely enough to cover rent and groceries, and the regulars liked to flirt with tired eyes and weak coffee in hand. But she didn't complain. She took the job without blinking, tied her apron, and learned how to smile through the ache in her feet and the dull exhaustion that never quite went away. During the day, she painted. Not because anyone asked her to or because she had commissions. At first, there were none, but because it was the only thing that made her feel like herself. She painted on anything she could find, scrap pieces of canvas from thrift stores, old wooden panels, even the inside of cardboard boxes when money ran short. Her favorite subjects were always people, especially women and children, captured in fleeting moments of strength or vulnerability. She didn't always know what she was painting until it was done, but often, the faces looked strangely familiar. One day she realized that she was painting herself, over and over again, disguised behind other lives. The pregnancy was hard. There were days she couldn't get out of bed from nausea and others when the silence in her apartment felt unbearable. But Hazel grew stronger with every passing week. She went to doctor appointments alone, took buses across town for discounted prenatal vitamins, and taught herself everything she could about childbirth and parenting from worn library books. When her labor finally began one rainy morning in early spring, she was already more prepared than she thought she'd ever be. She gave birth to a baby girl in a quiet hospital room with no one holding her hand, but the moment she looked into her daughter's eyes, deep brown and impossibly steady, something shifted in her. The pain, the loneliness, the years of doubt and fear all vanished beneath the weight of one small, perfect human. She named her Lily. It was the name she had whispered to her belly in the middle of the night, the name she had painted in soft cursive behind one of her canvases before she even knew if she was having a girl. Lily was born with thick brown hair, warm olive skin, and those unmistakable eyes. Edward's eyes. Hazel sometimes stared at her daughter for long stretches of time, wondering how someone so small could carry so much of someone she had left behind. But Lily was more than a reflection of the past. She was her own universe, curious, playful, and unbelievably strong. By the time she could walk, she had already claimed every inch of their apartment, giggling and falling and getting back up again like it was all a game. Hazel found new ways to earn money. She began selling her art at local street fairs, starting with small portraits for $20 apiece. People loved them, not because they were perfect, but because there was emotion in every stroke. She started getting requests, then referrals. Eventually, a small gallery asked to showcase her work. It wasn't much, just a few paintings tucked in a corner during someone else's show, but it was enough to make her believe she could build a real life here. She never once reached out to Edward. There were nights she lay awake, wondering if he thought about her, if he ever regretted the words he had spoken so easily. But she never let herself linger on it for long. Regret, she learned, was a luxury you gave up when you chose to survive. What mattered now was Lily, her laughter, her tiny hands gripping Hazel's shirt as she fell asleep, her wild hair and questions about the stars. Hazel no longer felt the need to explain her choices to anyone. The girl sleeping beside her each night was proof enough that she had chosen right. And in the quiet corners of their life, among the smell of coffee and paint, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. The air in Portland was brisk that morning, with the kind of early spring chill that hinted at rain but hadn't yet committed. Edward Blake stepped out of the back seat of a sleek black car, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal overcoat as he glanced around the unfamiliar street. He didn't particularly like Portland, too quiet, too damp, too soft around the edges. But the city had recently emerged as a hub for independent tech startups, and one of them had caught his attention with a promising acquisition offer. Business, as always, brought him places he otherwise would never go. He had an hour to spare before the meeting. His assistant had suggested a nearby cafe known for strong espresso and artsy charm. Edward didn't care about charm. He needed caffeine and silence. As he walked down the sidewalk, eyes scanning storefronts, his gaze was unintentionally drawn to a small gallery tucked between a bookstore and a florist. The window display was simple, several portraits on stretched canvas, unframed, each featuring a child's face captured in that soft, intimate light that made it feel like the subject might speak at any moment. One portrait in particular made him stop. A little girl, no older than 3, with dark brown hair tucked behind her ear, her chin tilted curiously upward as if looking at someone just out of frame. Her eyes were wide and deep brown, warm but serious. Something about her expression rooted Edward to the pavement. He couldn't look away, though he didn't understand why. There was a tightness in his chest, a strange pressure he hadn't felt in years. The longer he stared, the more it unsettled him. The signature in the corner caught his eye next, Hazel Moore. The name felt like a punch to the gut. He blinked once, twice, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else. But they didn't. Hazel Moore. Her name hadn't crossed his mind in months, not because he'd forgotten her, but because it had been easier to pretend she never existed than to face what he had done. Yet here it was, in front of him, scrawled beneath a portrait that seemed to stare into his soul. Something in him shifted. Without fully deciding to, he opened the gallery door. Inside, the air was warmer, filled with the scent of oil paint, wood, and the faintest hint of citrus. The room was small but thoughtfully arranged. Canvases lined the walls, children playing, mothers holding babies, women standing in doorways lit by golden-hour sunlight. Every piece was rich with emotion, capturing the kind of beauty that made the viewer feel something long after they had looked away. He walked slowly, absorbing each piece, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to form. Then he heard a voice. Light, musical, and very familiar. "I told you, you have to hold my hand when we cross the street, remember?" A small child's laugh echoed behind it, and Edward turned instinctively toward the sound. She entered the gallery from a side hallway, holding a little girl's hand. Her posture was slightly bent as she spoke to the child, her other arm clutching a small shopping bag. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a loose bun, a few strands falling around her face. She wore a paint-stained sweatshirt, sneakers, and no makeup, but she looked more alive than he remembered. Hazel. He froze. She hadn't seen him yet. She was too focused on the girl, whose curly brown hair bounced with each step. The child tugged on her arm, pointing to the portrait in the window. "Mommy, that's me," she said proudly. Hazel smiled, kneeling down beside her. "Yes, it is. That was your first time sitting still for more than 10 minutes. The girl giggled and spun in a small circle, the sound so bright it sliced through the air. Edward felt like the room had tilted. He was still standing there, rooted to the same spot, but the floor beneath him felt unstable. Hazel finally looked up. The moment her eyes met his, everything inside him dropped. For a long second, neither of them moved. Her green eyes, once filled with so much trust and affection, now looked guarded, distant, unreadable. She stood slowly, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Lily," she said softly, "why don't you go look at the bird painting over there?" The girl skipped off without question, leaving them alone in the center of the gallery. Edward opened his mouth, but no words came. Hazel didn't speak either. The silence between them stretched out like a chasm, built on 3 years of everything unsaid. Finally, she broke it. "What are you doing here?" Her tone wasn't angry, but it was far from warm. She didn't step closer. If anything, she leaned slightly away, as if bracing herself. I didn't know," he managed, voice rough. "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know any of this." Hazel crossed her arms, watching him with that same unreadable gaze. "You didn't want to know. You made that clear." Edward winced. He had no defense. She was right. "She's mine," he said after a moment, the words barely audible. Hazel tilted her head, a tired half-smile tugging at one corner of her mouth. "She's mine," she corrected gently. "I carried her. I raised her. I held her when she was sick, and I taught her to walk. I didn't ask you for anything, Edward. And I never will. He swallowed hard, shame crawling up his throat. Hazel, But she stopped him with a single look. Not cruel, just final. I have to get her home. And with that, she turned. Hazel called Lily over, took her hand, and the two walked out of the gallery as if he had never been there. He didn't follow. He couldn't move. He stood in the same spot for several more minutes, staring at the painting in the window as rain finally began to fall outside. Only now did he understand what that pressure in his chest had been the moment he saw the little girl's face. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. And he had never felt so hollow in his life. Edward didn't return to his hotel that night. He didn't return any of the calls from his assistant, didn't reschedule the meeting he was supposed to have, and didn't even notice the light rain soaking through the shoulders of his coat as he stood for over an hour across the street from the gallery, staring at the door Hazel had disappeared through. Something inside him had shattered, not with a dramatic crack but a slow, silent crumbling that started deep in his core. The image of that little girl, Lily, had taken root in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried to focus, to reason, to regain his sense of control, it wouldn't leave him. Her eyes haunted him. Not because they were beautiful or familiar, but because they were undeniably his. He eventually returned to his hotel in the early morning hours, his clothes damp, his face drawn, and his usual sharpness dulled into something unfamiliar. He couldn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring at the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling window, wondering how he had managed to live for 3 years without realizing the magnitude of what he had thrown away. Not just Hazel, though she had been more than he ever deserved, but the child. His child. A daughter. Breathing, laughing, growing without him. The guilt hit him in waves, each one stronger than the last, pulling him under with memories of that final conversation in his office. The words he'd spoken came back with venomous clarity. The baby or me? He'd said it like a question. But he knew now it had never been a question. It had been an order. And she had walked away. For 3 years, he had buried that moment beneath layers of work, success, and distraction. But now it refused to stay buried. It played on repeat in his mind, alongside the image of Hazel holding Lily's tiny hand, of the way she had looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet resolve. There was no hatred in her eyes. No bitterness. That was what made it worse. She had moved on. Built a life. Raised a daughter. And he hadn't even known. The next day, Edward returned to the gallery, but it was closed. A sign on the door indicated irregular hours. He waited again, sitting on a bench across the street like a stranger watching someone else's life unfold from behind a glass wall. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe that she would see him waiting and change her mind. Maybe that she would feel something. But she never came. And for the first time in years, Edward didn't feel like a man with power or control or influence. He felt like a ghost. Later that week, he found himself walking past a small park near the river when he saw them again. Hazel was sitting on a bench under a tree, sketchpad in her lap, while Lily played in the grass a few feet away, spinning in circles, singing to herself in a high, happy voice. It was the kind of scene Edward had never pictured for himself, never thought he would want, but something about it drew him in with an ache he couldn't name. He didn't approach. He didn't dare. Instead, he watched from a distance, his hands in his pockets, his jaw clenched tight, feeling like a man watching the life he should have had slip further away with every minute. Lily tripped and fell in the grass, letting out a startled squeal. Hazel was on her feet instantly, rushing to her side, brushing the dirt from her dress and kissing her forehead with practiced care. The tenderness of it made Edward's chest hurt. He had no idea what Lily's first word had been, what she liked to eat, how she liked to be tucked in at night. He had missed it all. He had missed her whole beginning. When Hazel glanced up, she saw him. This time, she didn't look surprised. Just tired. She stood slowly, said something to Lily, then began walking toward him. Her expression was unreadable, her steps measured. Lily clung to her hand, looking curiously at the tall man standing still as stone beneath the tree. Hazel stopped a few feet away and didn't say anything at first. Edward didn't either. The silence stretched like a fragile thread between them until finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "Are you following us?" He shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Then what do you want?" she asked. Edward looked down at Lily, who was watching him with cautious fascination, and when he looked back at Hazel, he felt everything he couldn't say rising in his throat like a wave too big to swallow. "I didn't know," he said, and though it wasn't enough, it was the only truth he had. "I didn't know about her." Hazel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in disbelief. "Because you didn't want to. I gave you a chance. You chose yourself." He didn't argue. There was no defense for what he had done. "I want to make it right," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I want to know her. I want to help." Hazel looked away for a moment, staring at the river, her jaw tight. When she looked back, there was pain in her eyes, not fresh, but the kind that had lived there for years and made room for itself. "It doesn't work like that," she said quietly. "You don't get to show up and decide you're ready. She's not a project you can fix or a meeting you can reschedule." "I know," he said. "I know that. But please. I want to try." She studied him for a long moment, and then, without a word, she turned and walked away, her hand wrapped tightly around Lily's. Edward watched them go again, the same way he had 3 years ago, this time not by choice, but by consequence. And it was only then, standing alone in the park, that he truly began to understand what regret felt like, not as an abstract idea, but as a weight, sharp and permanent, embedded deep in his chest. He had given them up once. And now, he would spend every breath trying to find a way back. In the weeks that followed, Edward's world shifted in quiet but irreversible ways. He returned to New York only briefly, just long enough to hand over the daily operations of his company to the deputy CEO and inform the board that he would be taking an extended leave. There were no questions he felt like answering. The business could run without him for a while, but what he had lost, what he might never regain, could not. For once, his absence in the boardroom didn't feel like a risk. The real risk, the one that consumed his every thought now, was letting Hazel and Lily walk away again without doing everything in his power to be worthy of standing near them. He went back to Portland, not to interfere, but to be close. From a distance, he began to learn their routines. Not in a way that was invasive or obsessive, but careful and respectful. He learned that Lily went to a local preschool 3 days a week, a modest place with chipped playground equipment and faded murals on the walls. He learned that Hazel still worked nights at the diner and spent her mornings painting, often walking with Lily to a nearby market afterward for groceries. He watched them from afar, not because he wanted to stay in the shadows, but because he hadn't earned the right to step out of them yet. Instead, he started quietly repairing what little he could. He contacted the preschool and made a private donation under the name of an anonymous patron, enough to fix the broken play structures, update the supplies, and ensure scholarships for other struggling families like Hazel's. He found the landlord who owned the building where Hazel lived and paid 6 months of rent in advance, asking that the tenant never be told who had done it. He also reached out to a small gallery owner in the Pearl District and recommended Hazel's work under a pseudonym, passing her portfolio along as if he had discovered her randomly. The gallery agreed to feature 3 of her pieces in an upcoming showcase, and when she received the invitation, he imagined her confused, perhaps skeptical, but proud nonetheless. He didn't do any of it for recognition. In fact, the thought of Hazel knowing made him uneasy. He wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness or force her trust, he knew better now. What he wanted was to make the road ahead a little easier for her, even if she never let him walk beside her on it. But still, the longing didn't fade. Every time he saw Lily's face, even in glimpses from across a street, something inside him ached. She had a way of carrying herself that reminded him of Hazel, head held high, feet planted with certainty, a gaze that met the world without apology. She was clearly smart and curious, fearless in the way children often were, and it stunned him how much he had missed. Her first words. Her first steps. The tiny victories and battles that came with growing up. There were nights when he would lie awake, imagining what her laugh sounded like up close, how she hugged, what bedtime stories she liked best. All things that once would have felt small now seemed monumental. One rainy afternoon, Edward spotted Hazel and Lily in the back corner of a bookstore cafe. Lily was coloring at a table while Hazel flipped through an art magazine, her fingers smudged with paint. Without thinking, Edward stepped inside and ordered a coffee, sitting 2 tables away, pretending to read the newspaper while stealing glances at them. When Lily dropped a crayon and it rolled under his chair, she scurried over to retrieve it. As she stood, she looked up at him with those familiar brown eyes, wide with polite curiosity. "Hi," she said. Edward froze for a heartbeat, then smiled. "Hi there." She didn't seem afraid, only inquisitive. "That's a nice drawing," he added, nodding to the paper in her hand. "It's a dragon," she explained, proudly holding it up. "But it's a nice dragon. It doesn't eat people. It just protects castles." He nodded seriously. "That's a very important job." She beamed at the compliment, then skipped back to Hazel, who had noticed the exchange and was now watching Edward with a guarded expression. Their eyes met, and this time, neither of them looked away. Hazel didn't smile. She didn't wave. But she didn't leave, either. Later that day, Edward received an email. It was from Hazel. Just one line. "Stop following us. If you want to help, say it. Don't hide." He sat with her words for a long time. They were firm but not cruel. Honest. Direct. He had crossed a line, and she had given him the choice to step forward or stay in the shadows where he'd been hiding. The next morning, he wrote back. "I don't know how to ask to be a part of something I abandoned. But I want to be honest now. I want to know her. And I want to earn whatever chance I still have to know you. I'll take whatever you're willing to give me. No expectations. Just honesty." He waited 3 days for her reply. When it came, it wasn't dramatic. Just a time and place. A park they had never visited together. A Saturday morning. No promises. No explanations. Just an opening. Edward didn't read into it. He didn't allow himself hope. But he showed up. And for the first time in years, the space between them didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a door. Just barely open. And that was enough. Saturday arrived with a bright sun that seemed out of place after days of cold drizzle. Edward had barely slept the night before. He woke early, dressed with care but not too formally, choosing a soft gray sweater and dark jeans that made him look less like the man who once wore tailored suits to breakfast meetings and more like someone who belonged in a park on a spring morning. He wasn't sure what to expect. He only knew that Hazel had asked him to come, and that alone carried more weight than any contract he'd ever signed. The park was quiet when he arrived, filled with the gentle rustle of wind through budding trees and the sounds of children's laughter in the distance. He saw them almost immediately. Hazel sat on a bench under a willow tree, her back straight, arms folded across her lap. Lily was playing in the grass nearby, spinning in circles, hair flying, completely absorbed in her own joyful little world. Edward hesitated for a few seconds before walking over, every step measured, unsure of what the next hour would hold. Hazel looked up as he approached but didn't stand. She didn't smile either, though something in her expression had softened since the last time they'd spoken. She motioned for him to sit. He did, leaving a respectful space between them. For a while, they said nothing. They simply watched Lily dart back and forth across the grass, chasing dandelion seeds and butterflies. Edward was grateful for the silence. It felt honest. He knew no words could undo the years that had passed. "She likes dragons," Hazel said eventually, her voice quiet but calm. "Not the scary kind. She says they protect people who don't have swords." Edward let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but more like a release. "She told me that once. In the cafe." Hazel gave him a sidelong glance. "I figured she might. She doesn't talk to strangers, usually." "I was surprised too," he admitted. "But I'm glad she did." Hazel looked back at Lily, who had now begun building a nest out of twigs and grass. "She's smart. Observant. She notices everything," Hazel said, her voice distant. "She knows something's different lately. She asked me last night who you are." Edward felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell her?" "I said you were someone I used to know. Someone who might want to know her too." He nodded, swallowing hard. "That's true." "I didn't say you were her father," Hazel added quickly. "Not yet. I'm not sure she's ready for that. And I'm not sure you are either." He didn't argue. She was right. Wanting something and being ready for it were two very different things. "I don't want to hurt her," he said, his voice low. "Or you." Hazel finally turned to face him fully. Her eyes were clear but heavy, the kind of gaze that came from years of holding things together without help. "Then don't disappear again," she said. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's not temporary. She doesn't need anyone else walking in and walking out of her life." He nodded. "I won't leave. Not this time." That had been the beginning. The next few weeks passed cautiously but steadily. Edward didn't try to push his way into Lily's life. He asked permission for everything, whether he could walk them home, whether he could bring Lily a book or a small toy, whether he could visit the gallery when Hazel had a new painting to show. Hazel appreciated his restraint. Trust was being rebuilt slowly, brick by brick, word by word. Lily took to him faster than Hazel did. She was endlessly curious, asking him questions about his favorite animals, whether he could whistle, whether he knew how to make pancakes. Sometimes, she called him Edward. Sometimes, just that man. He didn't mind. He knew she was watching him, trying to figure him out in her own quiet way. Then, everything changed. It started on a Wednesday evening. Hazel noticed Lily seemed more tired than usual after daycare. She refused dinner, wanted to lie down early, and kept saying her legs hurt. Hazel assumed it was a growth spurt, or maybe just exhaustion from running around all day. But the next morning, Lily couldn't stand without crying. She was pale, hot to the touch, and lethargic in a way that didn't feel normal. Hazel rushed her to the pediatric clinic. Tests were run. Blood was drawn. Doctors began speaking in hushed voices. And then the word came, one that drained all color from Hazel's face: a rare autoimmune condition, aggressive but treatable, requiring immediate medical intervention and a compatible blood donor for a plasma transfusion protocol. Hazel sat in the hospital hallway, her hands numb, her world spinning. Edward arrived within an hour of her call. She had hesitated before dialing him, but the fear in her chest was too heavy to carry alone. When he appeared, she saw something on his face she hadn't expected: terror. Real, Human fear, not for himself, but for the little girl lying in the hospital bed behind them. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "What do I need to do?" Hazel gave him the short version. The treatment, the urgency, the donor compatibility. Before she could even finish the sentence, he said, "Test me." He was a match. Not just a partial one, a near-perfect match. The doctors were surprised. Hazel wasn't. Somewhere deep down, despite the pain and everything that had happened, she knew fate was still watching. The procedure was done the following day. Edward donated twice in 1 week. He barely rested, refused hotel rooms, and stayed in the hospital family lounge, only leaving when Hazel convinced him to shower or eat something. When Lily woke up, weak but smiling, the first thing she said was, "You're still here." Edward nodded. "I told you I would be." Hazel stood in the doorway of the hospital room and watched them. Her eyes burned with tears she hadn't let fall in years. It wasn't just the fact that Edward had stayed. It was the way he looked at their daughter, with a mix of awe and protectiveness that couldn't be faked. It was how Lily reached for his hand without hesitation. It was the quiet, steady presence he had become, not loud, not showy, but reliable. That night, as the machines beeped softly and the nurses changed shifts outside, Hazel sat beside Edward in the small hospital room, her fingers wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. "I don't know who you were 3 years ago," she said softly. "But I see who you are now." He looked at her, exhausted, eyes rimmed with red, and nodded. "I didn't either. Until her." And Hazel, for the first time, didn't look away. The weeks after Lily's procedure unfolded in a haze of cautious hope. Her condition slowly stabilized, and the tension that had clung to Hazel's every breath began to ease. The hospital discharged her sooner than expected, with a strict schedule of follow-up visits and medication, but Hazel didn't complain. She carried Lily in her arms all the way to the car Edward had rented, and when he offered to drive them home, she nodded without hesitation. There was no longer any question about whether he belonged there. He had proven it with every moment of quiet vigilance, every sleepless night spent by their daughter's side, every time he asked the doctors more questions than even Hazel had the strength to think of. Once they were home, things didn't simply return to how they had been before. In fact, nothing had ever really been normal to begin with. Hazel found herself adjusting to a new kind of rhythm, one that now included Edward. He visited daily, never imposing, always asking before stepping through the door. At first, Lily would light up when she saw him, running to show him her drawings or pull him toward a stack of picture books. Hazel kept her distance, watching carefully, waiting for the illusion to break. But it never did. Edward had changed. Not in some grand, romanticized way, but in the subtle, meaningful ways that mattered. He began picking Lily up from daycare when Hazel had a gallery meeting or an extra shift at the diner. He cooked simple dinners, always asking what Lily liked first, and sat cross-legged on the floor while she insisted on brushing his hair with a plastic toy comb. He didn't try to force anything. He didn't ask for titles or favors. He simply showed up, again and again, until Hazel stopped counting the times. One afternoon, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch surrounded by a nest of stuffed animals, Hazel stood in the kitchen washing paint from her hands when she heard the soft sound of Edward humming. He was sitting beside their daughter, gently brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, his eyes soft with something far deeper than guilt or obligation. Hazel watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, not out of defensiveness, but because her chest was too full to do anything else. That look, the quiet wonder in his face, it was not the look of a man passing through. It was the look of someone who had been lost and finally found the only thing that mattered. Later that night, when Lily was tucked into bed and the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the heater, Hazel handed Edward a cup of tea and sat beside him at the small kitchen table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence between them had changed, no longer a wall, but a bridge. Hazel looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw someone who had been stripped down to the core and rebuilt not by ambition or pride, but by love. "I don't think I ever hated you," she said suddenly, her voice low, almost fragile. "I was angry. I was hurt. But I never stopped wondering who you could have been, if you had just stayed." Edward's hand tightened around the mug. He didn't look at her right away, afraid that even blinking might shatter the fragile honesty she had just offered him. "I hated me," he said finally. "Every day. Especially after I saw her. After I saw you. I think I kept working so much because it was easier to be successful than to admit I was a coward." Hazel nodded, her eyes wet but unblinking. "You were." He gave a small, sad laugh. "I know. But I want to do better. Not just be better, do better. For her. For you, if you'll let me." Hazel looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "You're not the man I left. I can see that. But I don't know what we are now." Edward leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let's find out. Slowly. No promises, no pressure. Just the truth. As much of it as you can give me." She didn't answer him that night. But the next morning, when he knocked on the door and asked if Lily wanted to go feed the ducks at the park, Hazel handed him her coat and said, "We'll both come." That became their new normal. Walks in the park, lazy mornings with pancake batter smudged on noses, evenings spent coloring at the kitchen table. They weren't a perfect family, Hazel didn't even call them that, but something in their closeness felt real. The past hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined them. They were something new, something slowly growing in the light that came after the storm. One weekend, Hazel brought Edward to her art studio. It was a modest space above a bookstore, filled with natural light and the smell of turpentine. She hadn't shared it with anyone outside her close circle. It was hers, her sanctuary. She showed him her recent paintings, portraits of women, mothers, children, and let him linger in front of the ones she had never exhibited, the ones she had painted in the quiet nights after Lily was born. One canvas in particular stopped him cold. It was of a man, standing just outside the frame of a doorway, his face blurred by shadow, but his posture unmistakably tense, like he wanted to enter but didn't know if he was allowed. "I painted that the week after she was born," Hazel said softly from behind him. "I didn't know if I hated you or missed you. So I painted both." Edward stared at the piece for a long time, his throat tight. Then he turned and reached for her hand, not with certainty, but with hope. Hazel didn't pull away. Not this time. They stood in the light of the studio, surrounded by unfinished canvases and the scent of old paint, no longer trapped by who they had been, but beginning to understand who they might become. Summer arrived gently in Portland, and with it came a kind of warmth that reached beyond the skin. It settled into quiet mornings, into the laughter echoing from Lily's bedroom, into the soft music that spilled from Hazel's studio window while she painted with the door open. For the first time in years, life didn't feel like survival. It felt like something whole, something earned. There were still scars, emotional ones that occasionally pulsed in the background, but they no longer led the story. And Edward, once a shadow haunting the edges of Hazel's world, had now become part of its rhythm. Their days began to carry a quiet synchronicity. Edward no longer asked if he could stop by. He simply did, often showing up with coffee for Hazel and a box of chalk for Lily, who had taken to decorating the sidewalk in front of the building with dragons and castles and what she claimed was a jellybean kingdom. On weekends, they explored the city like tourists in their own home, visiting farmers' markets, taking short hikes, letting Lily ride the carousel on the waterfront again and again until she was dizzy from joy. The three of them moved together like a constellation that had slowly found its alignment. Hazel found herself softening in ways she hadn't expected. One night, after Lily had fallen asleep with her arms wrapped around a stuffed owl, Hazel and Edward sat on the fire escape, sharing a blanket and a bottle of red wine. They talked about everything they'd never said, his childhood, her loneliness, what it had cost them both to live in separate silences for so long. It was the kind of conversation that healed more than it hurt. At the end of it, when Edward reached for her hand, she didn't hesitate. Their relationship was still new, still tender, like something growing through the cracks of old pavement. But it was real. Hazel no longer felt like she was giving something away by letting him in. She was reclaiming it. Rebuilding it on her own terms. By late August, Hazel's art was receiving more attention. Her work had been featured in a gallery downtown, and a collector from Seattle expressed interest in commissioning a series. Edward, now fully invested in her success, helped her set up a small online store and organized a fundraiser to support local artists, naming Hazel as one of the featured guests. He didn't just want to help her, he wanted to see her thrive. And Hazel, in turn, began to trust him in ways that had once felt impossible. There were still days when the past brushed against her heart like a cold wind, reminding her of everything she had done alone, but they no longer defined her future. Lily flourished too. She had started calling Edward Daddy on her own, unprompted, one evening when he helped her fix the wing of her favorite toy unicorn. Hazel had been in the next room, folding laundry, when she heard it. The word made her freeze. For a second, she waited for the sting of old pain to return. But it didn't. Instead, she smiled. That September, on the final evening of Hazel's solo gallery show, the space buzzed with soft music, laughter, and the clinking of wine glasses. Hazel stood in the center of the room, dressed in a pale blue dress flecked with paint near the hem, looking radiant in the way only someone fulfilled can look. Lily ran around the exhibit with her tiny camera, pretending to be a photographer, while Edward stayed close but out of her spotlight, proud and observant, content to let Hazel shine. Near the end of the night, when most of the guests had gone and the lights had dimmed, Edward asked Hazel to walk outside with him. The air was cool and quiet, the streets emptying as the city wound down. They strolled slowly, hand in hand, until they reached a small public square surrounded by string lights and benches. Edward paused, turning to face her. His heart was racing, not with nerves, but with something heavier, conviction. Hazel looked up at him, sensing the shift in his posture. "I used to think love was something that came second to ambition," he said quietly. "I thought I had to prove myself through achievement, through status, through being in control all the time. But when I lost you, when I saw Lily for the first time, everything changed. It wasn't just about regret. It was about realizing that I had measured my worth with the wrong ruler." Hazel's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. "I didn't deserve you back then," he continued. "Maybe I still don't. But I love you. I love her. And I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I've changed, not with words, but with how I show up every day." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small, simple velvet box. No grand gestures. No rehearsed speech. Just truth. He opened it. Inside was a ring, elegant, understated, a silver band with a single green stone that matched the color of her eyes. He didn't kneel. That had never been their style. Instead, he held the ring between them, his voice soft. "When I asked you to choose between me and Lily, you walked away without hesitation. That was the bravest thing anyone has ever done to me. But now, I'm not asking you to choose. I'm asking if you'll let me stand beside you. You and her. Forever. No conditions. Just love." Hazel didn't cry. Instead, she smiled through the emotion that clutched at her chest, and she stepped closer, placing her hand gently on his heart. "You always wanted to negotiate," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But this isn't a deal. This is a gift. And yes, The answer is yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Later, when they returned to the gallery to pick up Lily, she ran to them with a drawing in her hand, a sketch of 3 stick figures holding hands under a giant smiling sun. Above their heads, in crooked but determined letters, she had written, "My family." Hazel folded the paper and tucked it into her purse like something priceless. Because it was. This story is ultimately about redemption, the kind that isn't quick, easy, or cinematic, but earned slowly through humility, consistency, and love. What makes the ending so powerful isn't the proposal or even the happy reunion, but the fact that Edward changed not because he was forgiven, but before he was. He rebuilt himself not to win Hazel back, but to become the man who never should have lost her in the first place. Hazel's strength lies in her quiet endurance. She didn't need to be saved. She built a life, raised a daughter, and found her voice without looking back. But her ability to forgive, not blindly, but with clarity and caution, adds a beautiful depth to her character. It shows that healing isn't forgetting, and love isn't weakness. The ending is satisfying not because everything becomes perfect, but because the characters earn the peace they find. It's hopeful, but grounded. Romantic, but not naive. It reminds us that people can grow, love can survive past failure, and second chances, when handled with truth, can be even more powerful than first ones.